All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is Jason Crosby with SHP. I want to thank you all for attending our forum today. We are in our second part of a three-part series focused on ambulatory surgery care centers and various components of operational strategy. Hopefully, you're all logged in, able to view our presentation, which, as usual, we will upload to our site along with today's recording, probably the next day or two. As you come on board, you'll notice all the lines are muted. So if you have a question, please let us know in the chat box or by raising your hand within the Teams environment as you see on the current slide on your screen. And again, also, as with always, we are currently recording the session as you will hear online. Now, today, as I mentioned, this is ASC Series Part 201, second and three-part series related to ASCs, in particular to value-based care strategy. Today, we'll focus on various market trends, changes in the marketplace related to ASCs, Stark law changes, and becoming a specialist provider of choice, amongst other items. So we have a lot to cover, obviously, but as we said, please interact with any questions you may have in the chat box, and we'll be sure to address those currently or later on today. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started, and we'll hand over to Mike Scribner to get us going. Mike?
Kelly's going to do most of it, but basically what we want to do is kind of step back and kind of talk through the market is evolving clearly, and the history of where value-based came from, and Kelly will cover all this. Has sort of started federally, and then it kind of moved into kind of commercially but out to primary care only. But as it moves from that setting out to specialist, and then those of you with an ASC, we believe that there's a couple of real angles of opportunity here that Kelly will chat through. And so I'll turn it to her and I'll play color commentator as we go through this. Kelly?
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for that introduction. Jason, if we can actually skip down to the first text slide under market trends, we've really covered the agenda that we're going to cover and some of the background. In terms of the value-based care trends that we're still seeing, CMS obviously still driving the bus. Their innovation center is really what is fueling what we see as the latest developments in the commercial market as well. Still primarily modeled on shared savings, bundles, HEDIS level quality control. There's some deviation for commercial carriers, but everything is still very much following the model that CMS has been moving to over the last 10 years or so. The majority of value-based initiatives are still revolving around primary care base and attribution. Who patients belong to is where we're still seeing a lot of development and where a lot of the financial reward is, as we'll get down into later slides. To that end, though, we have seen specialist models starting to gain traction in the last 24 to 36 months. During COVID, surprisingly, we've seen the first models with oncology-based care models with episodic work that commercial payers are moving to. So next slide. Back to sort of CMS being the key driver, just thought this was really illustrative that sort of ongoing legislation is continuing to fuel the development of the value-based models that we're seeing. Obviously, MIPA, ACA, MACRA is the most recent version of that, have really led to all of these program innovations that CMS is running through their innovation center. Two of the biggest that we talk about are the advanced payment models and MIPS. Next slide. And from a broader perspective, CMS is using that legislation to fuel a lot of the development that we're seeing here. For specialists and ASCs, a lot of that is tied up in the bundle methodology that they've been running for orthopedic care for several years. Some specialists have been involved in the ACO or the DCE program as well, not necessarily with an assigned patient base, although we do see that some, for instance, in cardiology or nephrology care. But just there's a lot of movement that continues to go on at CMS that continues to trickle down into the commercial market. Next slide. So, we had touched on some of the specialist models that we've been seeing. Aetna has rolled out their own oncology care model, modeling similar to what CMS has been doing to incentivize oncologists to continue doing infusions rather than utilizing hospital services, which has shown to improve outcomes and keep lower cost. Anthem, obviously one of the largest commercial carriers here in the state of Georgia, has rolled out their episode-based payment. I believe their first models here in Georgia went live within the last 12 to 18 months. They're primarily focused on gastroenterology care, OBGYN bundles, and orthopedic care bundles. For GI care, it's really a prospective model that's based on your benchmark of financial performance. It's not a capitated model. At present, it's not a downstream model. It's really comparing you to previous performance to see if there are opportunities for any cost savings. Humana site of service redirection, what we're really seeing in that model is physician-based incentives for those that have ambulatory surgery centers to move more care from a hospital setting into their ASC setting, obviously where clinically appropriate, but incentivizing physician reimbursement by redirecting that care from a hospital into your own ASC. And then Humana total joint replacement bundles right now focused on the Medicare Advantage population. That's obviously where most of Humana's lives live. Again, similar to the episode-based payment for Anthem, it's a comparison not to market, but to your historical performance to look at where there are opportunities for savings in each episode bundle. Next slide. So some of the reports that we've seen coming out, Optum, obviously, which includes surgical care affiliates, they currently have more than 500,000 of their patients being accessed through value-based arrangements. So again, really speaks to the growth of that model. Surgical Center of Greensboro implemented their prospective 90-day bundles and released their first outcome report, I believe first quarter of this year, for their first 1,000 commercial patients. Overall, that created $15 million in savings and opened a new value-based revenue stream for them. And then to more direct pilot programs, Beacon Orthopedic and Sports Medicine and Anthem of Ohio piloted their unbundled arrangement that saved employers more than $1 million. So obviously the appetite is there, it's continuing to grow, and how do we tap into that? Next slide.
I guess one thing to add to that, Kelly, is that, and comment on this, I think it's fair to say that it currently, a lot of the driver of the specialist-based programs is location of care, and that the opportunity that sits for specialists with ASCs is that there is an underlying push that, be it through increasing of fee-for-service rates due to meeting some kind of measurements like that, or true direct savings by moving volume out of the hospital to the ASC side, that the orientation of those plans, forget regular quality measures and all the rest of that for the purpose of this statement, that a lot of the dollar value is simply in trying to move stuff out of the hospital and the ASC, which is exactly what you'd expect.
Great, 100%, Mike. So one nuance to all of this that we really anticipate is going to promote additional growth in this space over the coming years are the Stark Law changes that were implemented January 1st of this year. They were very much focused on value-based care exceptions. We've talked about how CMS is driving the bus. They have run some of these fraud, waste, and abuse exemptions in the ACO models as waivers for several years. Based on the outcomes that they were seeing there, it appears to have led to these new exceptions for groups that are partnering to achieve higher quality outcomes at a lower cost of care. So for value-based enterprises, they collaborate to achieve at least one of the following purposes: coordinating and managing the care of a target patient population, improving the quality of care for that population, and reducing the cost. So really what we've seen in the ACO model transitioning from just straight fee for service to managing the entire spectrum of a patient's care to achieve greater outcomes. Next slide. And so what in reality, what those value-based care exceptions look like is if you are taking on full financial risk, if it's at least a meaningful downside financial risk, and if it's primarily a value-based arrangement. So the key driver really here is a provider or physician being willing to accept either financial or accountability risk on the value of what they are providing. CMS is willing to forego many of its historic issues with collaboration and allow providers to collaborate in a more meaningful way. Next slide. So not going to get into sort of the full text, provided some greater detail here in reference about each of the exceptions, but full financial risk, that's a defining feature of a mature value-based payment system, and that the incentives to order unnecessary services or steer patients are automatically removed from that model because the provider is in effect assuming all of the financial risk. So examples to consider that we would see here would be fully capitated payment models, like bundles where a specialist group of providers is managing the entire spectrum of care, whether in orthopedics, that's the therapist care, hospital care if needed, the entire spectrum of care that's going into each of those services. Next slide. So meaningful downside financial risk exception. So where you were in a position to not accept capitation, and in Georgia, there are a lot of payers that are not ready to move to full capitation either at this time, but they are willing to partner where there is some downside risk. An example to consider here would be dual risk shared savings arrangements. Humana is definitely in that model. Anthem with their EPHC is in that model. We anticipate that their episode-based bundles would be moving in a similar direction as well. Next slide. And so next one is the value-based arrangement. And so this is really looking at the quality of the care that's being delivered. And, because of the numerous and requirements of this exception, it's really something that would need to be closely evaluated to make sure that the model is adhering to the Stark Law exception. But the partnerships that we would envision seeing here, focusing on reduced surgical complication rates, no admissions to the hospital, post-surgical care in an ASC setting. But providers in this arrangement do have to monitor performance, and they do need to hold the participants accountable, whether that's through, looking at improved care plans, and, down to removing underperforming providers from those arrangements. So the opportunity is absolutely presenting itself, but there are still parameters that would need to be met in those models. Mike, anything to add?
Only in as much as, and I think we're on kind of the cusp of this because this is probably unsettled law, and there's a lot that's going to play out about this over the next few years. But I think beyond just the kind of the natural use as value-based care, that specialist practices ought to be thinking about this more broadly, because now there's different ways that can be used to compensate them, compensate others for qualifying programs. And so beyond just the value-based care, as they think about their growth, there may be other opportunities in compensation that can be considered now that were previously off the table.
Michael, let me add something to that. There's another side of this too to be thinking about, and it's really, if you have an ASC, it's really understanding the physicians within that ASC, how they're being modeled and scored by the payers. Because think about as value-based grows, and we're experiencing this now, that where payers are working with programs for, and I'll use Anthem as an example. They have their EPHC program. And as they work, and they are currently working with primary care physicians that are in those programs, trying to get them to shift services out of the hospital and into the ASC setting. But in doing that, they are grading the physicians that are in those ASC settings. And we're experiencing situations where they're asking about care being redirected to specific physicians and not all the physicians within a practice. But specifically, they're asking that certain, in these cases, they're asking that certain physicians within the same practice be excluded from referrals. So it's not just the idea of being present, but it's understanding how the Blues or other payers are looking at your services and how they're scoring you within those services.
Agreed.
Next slide. So, John, that ties into the very well into the last part of the presentation. And so, you know, as we had touched on, while there's some development of value-based care for specialist providers, compared to the more mature primary care driven models, there's a significant difference in the kind of revenue that's being generated out of those. Great example of this, for the last performance year that CMS has announced in 2020, Medicare ACOs continued their trend of increasing savings. In that year, ACOs generated $4.8 billion in gross savings, total of $2.1 billion after accounting for the shared savings payments that they made out to their physician partnerships. And so significant revenue being generated through shared savings models. And this isn't just CMS data. We've seen this in commercial Medicare Advantage spaces as well.
It should be noted, Kelly, though, that's strong revenue in the ACO side, because that is strictly red, white, and blue Medicaid.
Right. And, you know, as we all know, with the continued growth towards Medicare Advantage, it's really only nationwide, I think about 60% of Medicare eligible remain traditional Medicare. At least 40% have moved on to MA plans. So even as that traditional Medicare population continues to diminish, the savings continue to increase and the revenue that's being generated for the ACO physician partners.
I would also add there, Kelly, that, and I think we're seeing, and you may speak to this, a proliferation of companies that are coming into Georgia that are modeled strictly for value-based care. They're nothing else. They build their models around the country strictly on building value-based models in states. And so they all target the Medicare Advantage. That's where their number one focus is. So when you think about this, we think in the traditional setting of the current payer population that we have now, but we're going to see exponentially over the next 24, 36 months, a lot of new players within the state that you're going to want to target and figure out how to be a participant within their models.
Absolutely. And so, you know, where, you know, with this revenue sitting out there, how do specialists and their ASC partners work with primary care physicians in these models for a slice of the savings? Next slide. And so, you know, based on their maturity in the market, ACOs, other shared savings models, you know, have really addressed the lowest hanging fruit already. They're coding risk appropriately to make sure that they're funding the care that's actually being delivered. They've worked on their ER diversion to keep people out of the hospitals and keep costs lower there. They've addressed the quality care and managing chronic conditions and medication adherence. So, you know, all of those have been tapped. So how do we look at addressing additional savings in those models. And as John touched on, that is really focusing on high value specialist referrals and identifying who those partners need to be that are giving you quality outcomes at the lowest possible cost. And so it's critical for them to address those costs. And that's why, as John noted, they're looking at what those metrics look like, what Anthem is showing in terms of how they're recommending that you direct care. And so for ASCs, it's really critical to be out in front of those choices that are being made, how they're presenting themselves to those primary care networks that are involved in shared savings models. You know, in your community, identifying who's in an ACO, who it is that is your ideal partner, because there are two benefits that come from that. The first is, you know, if you are their specialist of choice, it's greater direction of care. We are not just talking about, you know, looking at referral patterns based on I can get your patients in, you know, in the traditional way of how you seek primary care referrals. It's really getting to the point that, you know, you need to be directing everyone to me because I am your highest quality partner. I will help you meet the goals of your shared savings. So increasing your own fee-for-service revenue through that direct referral relationship. And then on the flip side, negotiating for a slice of the shared savings that you're helping them achieve. So opening up an additional revenue stream while still increasing your traditional fee-for-service revenue.
Yeah, at the risk of kind of repeating what Kelly just said, I think the traditional model, you know, any of the specialist groups that are on the phone has been, if you're in a competitive world and there are others of your specialty type around, and you're having some form of referral source outreach that goes on that kind of it helps your ongoing flow and all that. The traditional discussion is always, you know, there's a general understanding of the quality of my doctors, and I'm going to make it easy to receive the referral in. I'm going to give you the information back on the patient. We're going to share the EMR data, and so we're going to keep you in the loop. And of course, we're going to hand the patient back to you. That's the general sell to a referral source out there. In the new world, you can envision that the new version of that conversation is, let me understand what your measurements are on your primary care value-based programs. To the degree I can impact those, let me see the data and let me get upstream to help you do that. And by doing so, let me then become your de facto referral source for the vast majority of it, because I'm willing to work to help you achieve your savings numbers. And so what we really think is that at the end of the day, let's not get confused. At the end of the day, you're still in a very fee-for-service model. All of this may be, you know, a certain percentage of your additional revenue on the value-based side, but for today, you're in a fee-for-service game. And if you're in a competitive model, what's your competitive advantage to continue to grow your referral sources? And so it's just a different conversation than you would have envisioned, not, you know, 3 years ago, much less 10 years ago.
But Michael, that's an important statement, because think about this. When you hear a payer, you know this better than anybody. When you have a payer that runs their numbers and they said, I have X number of insured, and I'm picking this out of a hat, there's 30 orthopedists in a community, but to service my patient population, I really only need 5. And so where now they began to look at data of how to move that down and identify those 5, and then go forward and work in terms of implementing them in these value-based programs with partnerships like these primary care to redirect that care to them. So it's really thinking about payers beginning to not think about, it's sort of like narrow networks, but just in a different format, because they're using value-based dollars to create those narrow networks.
Agreed.
So Mike, that wrapped up. Do you want to take the next slide to talk through our upcoming webinar?
Yeah. For the next one, if you go down to the next slide, for the next one, I think kind of the next thing we need to get into is kind of the nuts and bolts of modeling. and kind of the interactivity with pricing transparency and kind of the data analytics that go around all that. There are several emerging models of ASC formats that are out there, fee schedule formats out there. Blue Cross wants to throw cops on us, all that kind of good stuff. And there are some pretty intricate modeling mechanisms that need to go with that. And so we will be presenting that next time. I believe it's May 17th, but whatever the date is, we'll get it out to everybody. With that, I guess it's back to you, Jason.
All right, excellent. Well, great presentation, guys, as usual. Nice and succinct. Again, if you'd like to propose a question, just use the chat box. We currently do not have any posted. Please be on the lookout for our e-blasts that go out regarding these webinars, as well as when they are uploaded, the PowerPoints and the recordings, you should get a notification. It may go to your spam, so just double check that for you, please. And as Mike said, we will shoot from May 17th for ASC 301 for the next Lunch and Learn series. As always, please send us any input as to what other topics you would like to see presented. And as always, as well, just any questions you may have, let's follow up. And if there's no further input, we'll give you some time back for the rest of your Thursday. And everybody have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye.